To give a bit of an overview about what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to start talking about kind of a common view that people have of selection pressures and evolution, and how evolution shapes organisms. And then I'm going to talk about the brain and inherently connected to the brain behavior as evolved mechanisms. And then I'm going to give a little bit of background on how some behaviorists in that movement in psychology thought of their work in relation to evolution. And that's going to segue nicely into talking about whether evolved mechanisms and learned mechanisms are two different things. Are they distinct traits in an organism? So I'm going to talk a little bit then about the behavioral mechanisms of learning, just quick overview, and a couple of neural mechanisms of learning. And then I'll talk about speech perception, which is one of my areas of interest, and speech production, of course. They go hand in hand as evolved mechanisms. And then finally, I'm going to give a little bit of my recent data. So when we consider selection pressures in evolution, people think of natural selection, very commonly, as a mechanism that selects the physical characteristics of organisms. And these physical traits that we think of as subject to natural selection are things like strength and speed and, our weaponry, our claws and our teeth. And so these are things that people think of as obviously chosen by natural selection. You have the two big gorillas that are going to fight with one another. So the one that is the strongest is going to be the one that wins and gets to reproduce more than the other one. And so he gets to pass on his genes. The fastest cheetah is going to be the one that can outrace an antelope and take it down. And it's going to be the one that gets to eat and survive and then go on to reproduce. And so on and so forth, with all of these obvious physical characteristics as subject to natural selection. And I think that anybody who embraces the idea of evolution accepts those things inherently. Survival of the fittest, right? That's what Darwin's talking about. But I think that people have a harder time in accepting that the brain is every bit as physical as every other part of our body. Our brain is not just a bunch of mush between our ears. And so our brain is a physically real organ, just like teeth and claws and muscles and all of those other things. And so the structure of the brain and the function of the brain are just as subject to natural selection and therefore to evolution as any other physical trait. And our brain produces our behavior. And so these behaviors that we do, produced by our brain, are subject to natural selection. So we can embrace then this idea that, like all of the other physiological structures in our body, our brain has these different functional parts. So, it's obvious when you're looking at the gorilla and its strength, all of the different parts of its body that come together to produce its physical strength, its ability to move its muscles in the way that it does in order to do the physical activities it needs to do to be that mighty animal. And the brain has these functional parts too. And neuroscience has shown us over and over again in many different ways that there are these different parts of the brain that are functional in certain ways. There are areas of the brain responsible for vision and different aspects of vision. Low-level vision, from being able to detect lines and colors and things like that, to higher-level aspects of vision, like knowing what an animal is, or people's faces differently than other stimuli that we might encounter. And the same for auditory portions of the brain, for detecting sounds, frequencies, amplitudes, and then for detecting human speech. Sensory portions of the brain where we process our sense of touch, our sense of pain, motor areas of the brain that move us around. So every area of the brain, and in fact, not just every area of the brain, but the neuron itself, the brain cell itself, has been selected for its anatomy, which is incredibly complex, and its functionality that stems from the way it's put together. So the behaviors that are produced by our brains have been selected to maximize our survival and reproduction, in the same way that all the other parts of our body have been selected to enhance and maximize our survival and reproduction. And some of these functions include things that people may think of as intangible, kind of mystical in a way. Our sexual behaviors, our emotional behaviors, language, learning, memory. These things that kind of seem intangible are the products of this very real brain. And so in psychology, one of the main driving forces for many years was behaviorism and the behaviorists' approach to psychology. And famous behaviorists include Ivan Pavlov, most people have heard of Pavlov, and Edward Thorndike, who was really big in educational circles. And they, in fact, saw themselves as following in Darwin's footsteps. So they're talking about how learning changes an organism. But they thought of themselves as coming right after Darwin and complementing Darwin. So they wanted to understand how our individual environments shape our behavior, shape our neural mechanisms, our brain, in the same way that Darwin was talking about how our ancestral environment has shaped our bodies, our brains, and our behavior. And so the behaviorists really saw their science as completely complementary to Darwin's. They saw their project of understanding learned behavior as going hand in hand with Darwin's project of understanding how our innate mechanisms have been shaped by evolution. And so people, you'll often hear ask the question, is this thing that I see, this trait, this behavior, this psychological phenomenon, a product of genes or environment? You hear that all the time. It's the nature versus nurture debate, right? Is autism more about your genes or your environment? Is psychopathology more about your genes or your environment? Is alcoholism genetic or environmental? Anxiety, depression, you name it. When we're talking about the behavioral sciences, that's a question that you'll hear raised by many people. And you'll hear people argue over it. Oh, well, your genes are just this way. Oh, no, your environment is what's important. So we ask this question, is it really nature versus nurture? Are evolved and learned mechanisms necessarily distinct? Is anything we do, any given behavior, innate, or is it learned? That's a question that people often ask and think about things as being one or the other. But in fact, those things are not distinct at all. We have not just can any given behavior be a product of both things, but evolution has chosen our brains to have neural plasticity. Natural selection has chosen a brain that can learn. That neural plasticity that we have in there, that ability to change, was selected for. This flexibility was critical for the survival and reproduction of our ancestors. And we can see really clear-cut examples of this in the animal kingdom. So farmers who have flocks of sheep in areas where there are wolves will often complain about the wolves eating their sheep. The ranchers don't want the wolves to eat their sheep, and so some smart ranchers will try this technique, and it's very effective. They'll sacrifice a sheep, and they'll put its body out, and they'll fill it with a thing that's called an emetic. An emetic is a substance that causes vomiting, okay? So the sheep is filled with this emetic. Wolves come along and eat the sheep carcass, and they go on their way, and then they start to feel sick, and they vomit, and they vomit, and they vomit. And that wolf will never again eat a sheep. And this is an evolved mechanism that many animals have to encourage us not to eat toxic substances. So in any given environment, the toxic substance, what is toxic in one environment, might be a different thing that's toxic in a different environment. And so being able to adapt to whatever's toxic in your given environment will allow you to avoid that toxic substance in the future, and you will be able to maximize your survival and your reproduction. But the sheep wasn't inherently toxic to begin with. There wasn't some evolved mechanism to just avoid the sheep in the beginning. The animal learned to avoid the sheep, as it would anything that it ate, and ended up causing it to vomit uncontrollably. And this happens to people too. So you may remember, eating a certain food at a certain time, or perhaps drinking a certain drink at a time, and you became violently ill from this, and you don't want to eat that anymore. Does anybody have this experience, eat or drink this thing anymore? Like, for instance, Captain Morgan spiced rum? All right, just saying. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the behavioral mechanisms, the neural mechanisms behind learning. So we can look at learning from a behavioral level, what's actually going on with people when they learn, and different ways that we can learn. And then we can look at the structure of the brain and what's happening at the neural level when people and animals learn. So conditioning is just a fancy word that means learning. It means we're associating one thing with another thing. And one way we can do that is through a process that I'm going to talk about right now called classical conditioning. There are certain stimuli in our environment that we can think of as unconditioned stimuli. These are stimuli that we naturally respond to a certain way. We are innately hardwired to respond to these stimuli a certain way. So for example, if I throw a punch at your face, you'll flinch and move away. It's a natural response. You never had to learn that. Okay? So the punch coming at your face is an unconditioned stimulus, or a horrible smell, and that you have that response of being, repulsed by that horrible smell. Or a very loud noise will capture our attention and cause a startle response. And you can see this even in an infant. You bang a loud hammer on something next to the kid's ear, and the little baby's going to startle and probably cry. So these are things that we're born with. And so the unconditioned response then is the response that we have to these unconditioned stimuli. It's our natural reaction to the stimuli. So we hear the loud noise, we startle. That would be the unconditioned response, the startling. And so in order to classically condition someone, and most people have some inkling of what classical conditioning is, Pavlov was the guy who first illustrated and really told us all about how this happens. And he had his famous, dogs salivating to the sound of a bell experiment. Okay? And we have this kind of in our zeitgeist. It's something that you see everywhere. There was an episode of The Office where Jim classically conditioned Dwight to put out his hand for an Altoid every time the phone rang. Okay? So this is something you see around. And what we do is we pair, in classical conditioning, an unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus. Okay, so the neutral stimulus would be like Pavlov's bell, or the phone ringing for Dwight. So it's something that naturally you don't have any particular response to, that every single person has all of the time in every context. So if you ring a bell to a dog that hasn't been trained, it means nothing to the dog. The dog will just stare at you, and it has absolutely no influence over the dog. And you don't naturally pick up a phone. You have to learn to do that. So, if somebody didn't know what a phone was and they heard it ring, a natural response wouldn't necessarily be to go hold it up to your ear, or certainly not to hold out your hand for an Altoid like Dwight ends up doing. So these things are neutral stimuli at first. But what we do is we pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus again and again and again. So we pair the bell with food, for instance. And so the dog salivates when the food is there. Of course, that's its unconditioned response to the food being the unconditioned stimulus. We show the food and ring the bell at the same time over and over again, and eventually we can take the food away, and the dog will salivate to the sound of the bell. And once that happens, once Dwight is putting out his hand in response to just the phone ringing with no Altoid being offered, he has now been successfully conditioned. And the bell or the phone ringing becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the response to that conditioned stimulus is the conditioned response. And then another really well-known form of learning, form of conditioning, is operant conditioning. And operant conditioning we use all the time, and it's based on consequences. In operant conditioning, you can either reward a behavior and reinforce it, or you can punish the behavior. So this is used in things like dog training. When you give your dog a treat when it does something that you want it to do, you're trying to train the dog to stand up on command, you give it a treat when it stands up. We use this with kids all the time. We want to potty train them. And so when they use the potty, we give them a reward. Over and over again, gold star on your paper in school, rewards for behaviors that we want you to continue with. That's operant conditioning. So reinforcement then strengthens our responses, making them more likely to occur, and punishment, on the other hand, diminishes responses, weakens responses, making them less likely to occur. So these things are well established. These are well established forms of learning. But we also know what's going on a neural level when these things are taking place. So to give a bit of background about how your brain cells communicate with one another, neurons send signals to other neurons, brain cells send signals to other brain cells by releasing a chemical called a neurotransmitter. And this neurotransmitter takes information from the one cell in the form of this chemical neurotransmitter across the synapse to a secondary cell, to the next cell. And these neurotransmitters bind to receptor sites on the second cell. And then this can cause a number of different processes to happen in the secondary cell, and one of those processes might be activating the secondary cell. And you've probably heard of some famous neurotransmitters: dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, which is also called norepinephrine, because these neurotransmitters have been linked to a variety of psychological illnesses that are very common. And drugs that we take, psychopharmaceutical drugs that we take, work on these systems, both illegal drugs and the kind that you would get from your doctor. And so this is a mechanism. This is a physically real thing that happens when one neuron talks to another. And so it can be affected by natural selection. It is subject to evolution. And indeed, all of these processes and all of the structures of the neuron are subject to evolution by natural selection. I'll take you real briefly through one of the mechanisms of learning that we know of, called long-term potentiation. So there are a number of mechanisms of learning in the brain. I'm going to talk about two real briefly. And if you were one of my students, you would have to learn this for your test, but you guys could just relax and let it wash over you. When we're talking about learning, the primary neurotransmitter involved is glutamate. Glutamate is all over your brain. And when an excitatory event occurs, when you encounter a stimulus, glutamate is released by neurons. And we'll call the neuron that's releasing the glutamate the presynaptic neuron, because it's before the synapse. And this neurotransmitter, this glutamate, goes across the synapse and binds to receptors on the second cell, the next cell, which we'll call the postsynaptic cell, because it's after the synapse. And when this happens, little doors, little gates, little channels on the second neuron open that allow positive ions. These are chemicals present in all over in your body, enter that secondary cell, and they can excite that second cell. These receptors are called AMPA receptors. Glutamate binds to them, little door opens up, positive ions come into the cell, excites the cell. But there are these other receptors in these synapses called NMDA receptors. And NMDA receptors want to receive glutamate. They have docking sites for glutamate, but those docking sites are blocked by a magnesium ion. So there's no place for the glutamate to bind. But when a second excitatory event occurs, like a second stimulus, more glutamate is released by that presynaptic cell. And that second dose of glutamate, through a series of processes that I won't bore you with right now, knock that magnesium ion out of that pore that it's sitting in the NMDA receptor. And now glutamate can bind to both the AMPA receptors and the NMDA receptors. And indeed it does. And when glutamate binds to the NMDA receptors, it triggers the cell to build more AMPA receptors. And so that synapse fills up with AMPA receptors. And with more AMPA receptors, when glutamate is again released by the presynaptic cell, it makes it much easier to send the postsynaptic cell into action. It makes it much easier to activate it. Lots more places for positive ions to come in, much easier to activate the second cell. And so you can have just one stimulus presented now, and it will activate that cell just like it took two stimuli before to do. And that's what associative learning is. That's what happens when you learn something new. That's what happens when you're classically conditioned or operant conditioning, or when you're studying your books for class. You're causing your cells to build more AMPA receptors so that you can have those thoughts easier the next time, so that those electrochemical signals can flow more easily. That's why the more you study, the easier it is for you to answer a question on a test. You're building more and more AMPA receptors. There are other neural mechanisms of learning, like for non-associative learning. The guy who found this out, his name was Eric Kandel, who's now an adorable little old man. And he got the Nobel Prize for figuring this out, and he worked with a sea slug. And the reason he worked with the sea slug is because the sea slug is incredibly simple. You know, our brains are very complex. We take in sensory information from the outside world, we process it all around in our brain, and then our brain has motor areas that move us around and produce all our behaviors, walking, talking, you know, my hand gestures, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is produced by motor neurons. Well, the sea slug is super simple. It has a sensory neuron that comes in that connects to a motor neuron. So sensation is detected, like sense of touch, moves the muscle in response to being touched. And so if you take these little sea slugs and you squirt a jet of water on their gills, it doesn't hurt them, but the jet of water makes them retract their gills. But if you keep squirting that stream of water, eventually the slug learns something. Oh, that stream of water isn't going to hurt me. I can still keep my gills extended and extract oxygen from the water. And so it does. And this process is called habituation. Okay? In habituation, you get used to stuff. And habituation happens all the time with people. You put on your clothes in the morning, you feel them when you put them on, but then you become habituated to the clothes being on you. You get a new car, and at first it's very exciting, but then you become habituated to your car. You hear a noise when you walk into a room, some kind of strange hum, but eventually it just becomes background noise. You become habituated to it. And that's what's happening with the sea slug. And what Kandel found was all that was happening was on that presynaptic cell, when it was releasing its little neurotransmitters into the synapse, positive ions had to come in, calcium ions had to come in order for those neurotransmitters to be released. And so what this presynaptic cell would do would be just downregulate the amount of calcium coming in, the amount of positive ions coming in. And so that downregulated the amount of neurotransmitter being released, and now it was much harder to send that motor neuron that retracted the gills to activate. And so the gills stayed open, even though there was a jet of water. Very simple mechanism, but of course build up many, many simple mechanisms, and you have the human brain. So clearly, when the point of looking at these mechanisms, the reason I took you through all that, is to show you that these are physically real things in your brain. These are just as physically real as your hands or your arms or the crocodile's teeth. These are physically real things, and so they are just as subject to evolution and natural selection as any other part of the body. So your brain and your behavior produced by your brain is subject to these same processes. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about my specific area of research, which I look at speech perception and, of course, production, which goes hand in hand with it. And then I'll give you a little tiny bit, a very little tiny bit of recent data. So when we think of language, when we think of human speech, philosophers for centuries, millennia really, thousands of years, have thought of speech as a hallmark of our species. So we have language in a way that no other animal has language that we know of. The complexity of our language just outdistances any other animal on Earth in terms of its complexity. And in addition to it being as complex and so much more complex than any other animal uses, we use it all the time. Language is central as a characteristic in our species. I wouldn't be up here giving this talk without language. There would be no science without language. There would be no internet without language. There would be no cell phones. None of this. Imagine how difficult it would be to transmit information to anybody else. Future generations, people in other places without language. It would be so limited. So people will sometimes think of language as something that falls under the arc of art. You know, we give these speeches. We have the people stand up and act, and it involves language. We think of writing and books as something that's under the purview of art. And so we kind of see these things as intangible and ineffable in a certain way, that we can't really understand the mechanisms there. It's too fluffy, it's too ephemeral. It's not something we can understand with mechanistic processes. But understanding the brain as an organ falls under the purview of science. And the brain is quite tangible and quite knowable. Even if we don't know everything about it yet, it is knowable. We can see the structures and the functions of the brain as evolved. And a great deal of our brain is dedicated to speech perception and speech production. We know that there are areas crucial to understanding speech and producing speech. We know that if you have a stroke that kills that area of the brain, that you're going to have specific deficits that have to do with what that functional area of the brain does. And so it follows then that these areas, and importantly, the behaviors produced by these areas, have been subject to natural selection. These are evolved mechanisms. Language, speech perception, speech production has been chosen by natural selection because it maximized our survival and reproduction. So I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that I study. And one of the things I study is a phenomenon called speech alignment. And in speech alignment, two people who are having a conversation with one another start to sound more like one another as the conversation goes on. They start to pick up the patterns of the other person's speech. The time differential between words produced, the volume, the intonation, all of these various aspects of speech we pick up when we're conversing with someone. And most of the time, this is happening unconsciously, but it may cross the line into being conscious when somebody's speech is very different than ours. Maybe you've been having a conversation with somebody who has a different accent than you do, and you find yourself starting to pick up their accent a little bit, or vice versa. They're picking up yours. So this is a form of unconscious mimicry, meaning that this is something that we do without even being aware that we do it. Anytime you enter into a conversation with a person, you are subject to aligning your speech with that person. And unconscious mimicry has shown many social benefits. So people who are engaging in unconscious mimicry will rate their conversational partner as more likable, as having greater rapport with them. So unconscious mimicry is thought of as a kind of social streamlining. It helps us to develop these positive social relationships with one another. It helps us to navigate our social world. And so past research shows that we can detect this speech alignment. We know that if we have a bunch of people say a list of words, and I'm going to call those people models, and then we have another bunch of people come in and listen to those words and say those words after the model, we call those people shadowers. We know that the shadower will start to sound more like the model after they've been listening to their speech and saying the word after the first person. So the first person says the word cabbage, the model says the word cabbage, the shadower says the word cabbage right after, and they start to sound more alike. And raters, people who don't know those two people at all, can come in and tell the difference between the shadower who shadowed that model and somebody else who didn't shadow that model, a person who wasn't involved in that exchange of words. And I think that an ability to rapidly learn to better do this would offer important social advantages for people. So imagine that you're a high school girl, okay? You go to high school for the first time, you're new to the school. And you see different cliques of girls all around, different groups of girls, different groups of boys, all of these different people around. And you're listening to the most popular girl, Betty, talk to her group of friends. Unconsciously, Betty is the model, and her group of friends are her shadowers, and their speech is aligning. And you can detect that, even unconsciously, this research shows. So if you could learn to really quickly figure out, even unconsciously, who's aligning to whom, it would tell you really important social information. Knowing who's friends with whom and who's not friends with whom can help you navigate that social environment a lot better as, let's say, this high school girl. Or imagine this in business. Imagine it in your family, anywhere. If you can detect the people who are having social rapport, who are aligning with one another, and really quickly pick out who's friends with whom, even unconsciously, that can help you navigate that social situation better. And now imagine you are this new girl at high school, and you go to a whole new group of people, and unconsciously you know who in this whole new group of people is friends with Betty because of their manner of speech. You know who might not like Betty and not be friends with Betty unconsciously because their speech is not as similar. And so if you could rapidly learn this, that might offer very important social advantages, and nobody had ever looked at if this was subject to learning. And so our experiment took no more than a half an hour. And when I say a half an hour, I mean from the time you came in to sign the consent form to the time we told you, thank you, have a nice day. Took no more than a half an hour. The actual procedure, a lot of people finished it in 10 minutes. And here's what we found. If we brought people in, okay, and we started them out, picking out who was aligning to whom in a model and shadower judgment task, we found that people did better than chance right away when they first got there. They were scoring about 59% correct, so better than chance levels, significantly better than chance, 59–60% when they first started. And over the course of just about 10 minutes, they were able to improve when they got feedback about whether or not their judgments were right or wrong. In a natural setting, you're getting feedback all the time. Oh, yes, that person is friends with Betty. Oh, no, that person's not. So we gave people feedback, and we found that giving them feedback, yes, you're right, or no, you're wrong, rapidly improved their abilities over just, a 10–15-minute experiment. And not only that, but this improved ability for the people who got feedback carried over into a second section of the experiment where we asked them to now listen to those same models, but a whole new group of shadowers. So now it's just like the new girl at high school listening to Betty, and then going over, Betty and all of her friends in one group, and now going over to a whole new group of friends and being able to figure out which people are friends with Betty. So the learning was able to transfer to new shadowers of those same models. So these data show that rapid learning is possible in alignment detection. People can do this, and that's novel. And this ability, I argue, would offer important social advantages for people, just like being able to detect unconscious mimicry in general offers social advantages for people, and that's fairly well established. But being able to learn to do it better within a context, wow, that's really, really helpful. And we are social animals. Our social world, our language, our speech perception abilities, these subtle, unconscious abilities that we have, like all of our behaviors, have been subject to evolution by natural selection. Being social animals, the animal that operates optimally in its social environment is the animal that survives best and reproduces best. And so we've evolved these incredibly subtle mechanisms for negotiating our social world, and that involves our speech perception. So these traits that offer advantages to us in general have been selected by evolution, and learning, which is what we see here, people were learning to better detect speech alignment, but learning in general is one such trait that has been subject to evolution by natural selection. And so nature and nurture go hand in hand. Our ability to adapt to our environment, our ability to learn is in our genes. Okay, thank you.
We have time for questions, comments.
Now, would you say that this directly, I don't want to say correlate, but it's like in nature, animals reflect this as much as humans, or is it more of a human characteristic and that's what makes us so different?
Well, of course, our speech our language abilities are much more complex than any other animal that we know of. But animals definitely are communicating with one another and using language-like abilities. So I would think that abilities to detect these kinds of gestures would evolve in other animals that would maximize their survival and reproduction. So for example, you could look at threat gestures in animals, those kinds of things. And you'll see an animal, display a threat gesture. It says, I'm feeling aggressive right now. The wolf bares its teeth. And you'll have another animal that gives a submissive gesture in response to that. Oh, hey, I'm gonna lick your face, or I'm gonna turn over and show you my belly, and that's gonna show you that I'm cool and everything's fine and don't attack me. And those kinds of things have social functions for them. It leads to not having fights. And you could compare this to human abilities where, think of Jersey Shore. What's that guy who says, come at me, bro, come at me, bro, come at me, bro, right? That's a threat gesture in humans. And so, if we're detecting these kinds of things, then who's hostile with one another and who's friendly with one another, and then improving these abilities from situation to situation, it's all of the same thread, but it's specific to what that animal needed to do to its social world. Does that answer your question?
Do you think that it could be reflected in writing as well as speech, or do you think that's a whole different thing?
I know that people are looking a lot into writing right now because writing communication has become so much more common in our daily exchanges. And I know one thing that we see in these exchanges is that things tend to be read negatively in a way that we don't necessarily perceive speech. So, you get an email from your boss and it says, have you looked at the Johnson file? And, that comes across as, have you looked at the Johnson file? I know as a professor, I write little comments on people's papers, reword this, and, the person, all these little comments in here, and this is my frame of mind when I'm writing it, this, rephrase this kind of thing, and the student comes in and says, why did you yell at me on this paper? So I think that, that there are social cues going on there, but I think that with writing, we come in with more of an expectation of what's already gone before with what's being said in the writing, or our understanding of the social relationship, that this is the person who's in power, and here's how the power dynamic is. And so we have these perceptions of how it goes. But I know that that's an active area of research looking into that, and it's new. You should go get your PhD and look at that.
Who have like speech impairments and like for whatever reason or disability that say couldn't communicate through speech or writing even?
So they're going to have a lot harder time picking up on the social cues. And actually, one of the things I talked about last year was differences that people have who have communication differences. So for example, folks who use sign language, even though their visual abilities are much better than most people's visual abilities, because they rely on vision so much more than because they're hearing impaired, their abilities to detect emotion are actually not as good as normal hearing populations, even just talking about the visual modality, just looking at the facial expression. And so the way that you express language then, or differences in language expression we know then, are going to affect these other subtle forms of communication and change or maybe disrupt our abilities to bring that kind of information in. So if you are having, let's say an aphasia, you're going to have a really difficult time with bringing in these kinds of subtle social cues. And I think that it's interesting to think of things that way, because most people like to dissociate language from other forms of social communication, like emotion and understanding, those kinds of social alliances and things like that. But my research says that they probably are actually connected. So I would wager a guess that impairments in one, even if we can't immediately detect, or there's not a broad brush way to detect impairments in the other, that if we looked at it more carefully, we might be able to find that there are. Does that answer your question?